desert, one of the harshest climates in the world. A huge expanse of unforgiving rock, scrub and sand the size of Europe. To me, it looks like a place of nothingness. But it was from here that a group of desert nomads came to transform the northwest corner of Africa into a vast empire that stretched from the Sahara to Spain. What started with one man's mission grew into a kingdom which lasted for centuries. Its rulers generated tremendous wealth, created great architecture, and promoted sophisticated ideas in an ordered society. They were called the Berber, and they changed this part of Africa forever. We know less about Africa's past than almost anywhere else on Earth. But the scarcity of written records doesn't mean Africa lacks history. It's found in artifacts, culture, and the traditions of the people. In this series, I'm exploring some of the richest and most vibrant histories in the world. I'm here in Morocco to explore how a small collection of Berber nomads created a vast kingdom out of nothing, and how the very forces that created that kingdom ultimately helped to destroy it. Century Morocco, a modern Islamic state whose Arab king claims descent from the Prophet Muhammad. He rules over a country with a culture and a history as diverse as its landscape. Morocco has coasts that face the Atlantic and the Mediterranean Sea, snow-covered mountains almost as high as the Alps, and the bone-dry fringes of the Sahara Desert. The dominant languages spoken here now are from Arabia and Europe, but nearly half the population still speak Berber, the language of the indigenous Africans. 1,000 years ago, this was their land, but there was no sense of a nation-state. Instead, on either side of the Atlas Mountains lived small, independent Berber clans of farmers, traders, and nomads. These people were Muslim, but they maintained their traditional Berber customs, and they didn't always follow Islam to the letter of the law. But in the mid-11th century, one man changed everything. A Berber who'd studied the Quran and had become a charismatic, fiery preacher. Idealistic and uncompromising, he had a clear mission to change his fellow Berbers into proper Muslims, schooled in the strict fundamentals of their religion. His name was Abdullah ibn Nasir, and his travels to Islamic centers of learning had left him a student of a strict legalistic interpretation of the Quran. He started his mission in the Western Sahara, where he pulled together an alliance of tribes and appointed himself as spiritual leader. In so doing, he started a series of events that completely transformed Northwest Africa. In the year 1054, he led an army of thousands of nomads and headed for Sijil Masa, then a major trading post on the edge of the Sahara and one of the most important cities in Africa. Ibn Yassin and his followers were called Almoravids, from a phrase meaning those bound together in the cause of God. They were determined to bind everyone to the cause. They had one simple mission: jihad. The term jihad today carries connotations for many people of anti-Western extremism. But Ibn Yassin's holy war, his struggle to uphold a true understanding of Islam, was aimed at his fellow Muslim Berbers. This spectacular ruin is now all that's left of Sijil Masa, a city of well over 50,000 people, built in the middle of one of the biggest oases in Africa. Now a quiet and tranquil backwater, the date palms and irrigated fields hide clues to a much bigger and more significant past. And it's on a shingle bank, at the heart of the oasis, where the ruins of the mud-built city lie. The taking of Sijil Masa would be the first major building block of an Almoravid kingdom. So what attracted Ibn Yassim here?
The wealth of the city. This city was very prosperous. In fact, it was the commercial hub of Morocco, a huge city in a huge oasis.
Dr. Eric Ross has been involved in some of the recent archaeological studies here that have confirmed why this was such an important prize for Ibn Yassim.
I call it the Casablanca of 1,000 years ago, because Morocco wasn't looking to Europe or the Atlantic. It was looking across the Sahara. The Sahara was wide open to trade.
So there were goods coming from all over the region and they were being traded and exchanged here?
Yes.
And what sorts of things are being traded here?
Cloth, manuscripts and books, horses also. The most important was the gold, trading mostly south across the Sahara. Places like Mali and Senegal today were producing especially gold. So gold was the main part of the wealth of the city. We know gold coins were minted here, they were stamped here, and they were exported. And mostly they were exported eastward to Egypt, Iraq, Central Asia, and they ended up in places like India.
Wow. So they're trading tendrils, they'd stretch all the way from West Africa as far as South Asia.
Yes, absolutely.
It's a trading powerhouse.
Yes, it is. And the envy of empires across the continent. They all tried to take it, and the Almoravids succeeded in doing that.
Once they had Sijil Masa under their control, the Almoravids set about securing the source of the city's gold trade. They crossed 1,000 miles back to the opposite side of the Sahara and seized the trading town of Oudakhost. By controlling the supply of gold across the desert, they had a virtual monopoly on this, the most lucrative of trades. With a considerably strengthened army of weapons and camels taken from Sijil Masa, the Almoravids now had what they needed to carry their jihad beyond the Sahara. But they couldn't have done any of this without another important resource, the key to life itself. Water sustains everything in this harsh climate, and the Berbers had the know-how to find and to move it under the desert. These are Qattara, the part of an ancient Berber irrigation system. And you see these mounds stretching out across this landscape. What you see on the surface belies a very complex network of tunnels that sit underneath the ground, funneling the water across this landscape, because water was such a rare resource. These access shafts are all that you see of the gently sloping tunnel system that taps into the underground water table. These systems could take water for miles in this very arid, dry, hot landscape, and to take it where it was needed. And it just says how the Berber understood this landscape, how they worked with it, how they used the small resources that they had to their advantage. With a powerful army, money, and the rallying call of Islam, Ibn Yassim now had the potential to create a Berber nation. The Almoravids' jihad had an unstoppable momentum, but now they wanted to take their brand of Islam to every Berber, and that meant crossing the Atlas Mountains. The high Atlas Mountains rise to over 13,500 feet. They form a natural divide between the desert and the more fertile and populous lands on the other side. But these were dangerous times, and this was a perilous area to be travelling through. 1,000 years ago, these valleys would have carried one of the main trade routes through the mountains, and that made it attractive to thieves. Ibn Yassim and his men were in bandit country. This is called the Road of 1,000 Kasbahs. And kasbahs are these fortified houses that were once owned and used by Berber merchants. These buildings would have often been used to house things like gold and silks that came across the desert. And they had to be fortified because this was a dangerous territory. These are beautiful buildings, but their fortifications give a sense of what it was like in those days. The Almoravid army traversed this hostile environment with 400 horsemen, 800 cavaliers, and 2,000 foot soldiers. It was a treacherous journey in an alien landscape. 1,000 years ago, when Ibn Yassin and his army came up these passes to cross these mountains, they were entering completely new territory. They were desert warriors, and these mountains and everything beyond was a completely different environment to them. But they had a clear goal. To the northwest of the mountains lived the tribes of Berbers that the Almoravids considered to be heretics. In 1058, the first people to feel the force of Ibn Yassin's army were the rulers of Agmat, a small city nestling in a lush valley on the north side of the mountains. Agmat became the new headquarters from where the army took their jihad to the tribes nearby. But it's been difficult for historians to uncover what life was like in Agmat at the time, for one simple reason. No one knew where ancient Agmat was. It was thought to be a lost city, but actually it was right here, beneath our feet. The dig has revealed only a small portion of the city so far, but this hammam, or bathhouse, is one of the most substantial and important finds. These remains illustrate the scale of the settlement here, and show just how expertly they understood how to use water as a foundation of civic society.
L'eau est une richesse très importante dans la région.
Abdullah Fili has been slowly unearthing the remains of the buildings here since the dig first started.
Au-delà de l'utilisation de l'eau dans les bâtiments publics comme le hammam, la mosquée, le palais, etc., nous avons également l'utilisation d'eau dans l'irrigation, on répartit l'eau selon deux composantes. La première composante, c'est les bâtiments publics et les bâtiments privés, les maisons, etc. Et puis après, les trois autres jours, c'est pour l'irrigation des champs.
Remarkably, this entire building, which dates from the time of the Almoravids, more than 1,000 years ago, was excavated almost intact.
Et effectivement, on trouve que c'est l'un des plus anciens hammams au Maroc. Après celui, il représente donc l'un des plus grands hammams de l'Occident musulman. Et ça permet effectivement d'avoir un chef-d'œuvre architectural extrêmement important. C'est énorme comme hammam. Il fait pour le moment 500 mètres carrés. Ce qui est exceptionnel pour un hammam parce que ça demande justement une ingéniosité au niveau des techniques de chauffage, au niveau des techniques de l'alimentation en eau.
This is absolutely amazing. I'm used to seeing their earth-built buildings, but to see this kind of stone and mortar construction, but also the water engineering, this is real innovation. It's so exciting. There was hot and cold running water. The temperature of the three rooms increased the nearer they were to the huge fires that heated the water as it came into the hammam. This was civilized living.
C'est pour ça que la question de l'eau est vraiment centrale pour le fonctionnement d'un bâtiment aussi important, car il permet la purification des gens. Les gens viennent ici se purifier, par exemple, une fois par semaine, une fois toutes les 2 semaines, etc., pour se reposer, parce que le hammam, avec le système de chaleur, ça permet de reposer les corps et aussi parfois les esprits.
These were people who came from the desert, for whom water was a precious resource. This is more than a bathhouse. This is a temple to water. and what a place. The Almoravids were beginning to appreciate city life, but there was a problem. For desert nomads, this city was just in the wrong place. Surrounded by mountains and hills on three sides, Ermak was not in a good defensive position. As people most suited to fighting in the open, it made them feel vulnerable. After a little more than a decade, the Almoravids looked for a new home, a new base from where they could expand and take on even more territory and infidels. The Almoravids had the desert in their DNA, and they chose a flat, dry, open piece of land around 20 miles from the foothills of the Atlas Mountains. They pitched their tents and named their city after the Berber words, the land of God. It was called Marrakesh. The founding of Marrakesh in 1070 represents a point when a loose band of marauding jihadists become an imperial force to be reckoned with. What began as a collection of tents rapidly became an established city. The Berbers who settled them were offered security in return for their taxes, and that paid for the further expansion of the Almoravids' territory. The movement seemed unstoppable. Even when Ibn Yassin died, while fighting Berber heretics, the holy enterprise continued unabated. After the death of the fiery preacher Ibn Yassin, a new man took charge of the jihad. His name was Yusuf ibn Tashfin, and he made a greater contribution to the dynasty than any other man. He turned a fledgling kingdom into an empire. While Ibn Yassin had been the spiritual leader who had inspired the Almoravid movement and led it out of the desert, Ibn Tashfin would take the dynasty even further. It began with Marrakesh. Qattara were dug to supply water to the growing population, and walls were built to surround it.
The street that we are, yes, it was made at this time, and especially the walls, we will see, the walls were made at this time.
Former Minister of Education, Professor Mohammed Khanidri, knows Ibn Tashfin's city well. What sort of man was Ibn Tashfin? What was he like?
Yes, Ibn Tashfin was a very high man, very courageous, and beautiful, handsome. Handsome, yes, handsome. And he was especially very curious and a very strong man. Very strong man that has a big personality.
And how did he change Marrakesh?
He said that here we'll have a palace, here we'll have a commerce, here we'll have an administration. And he made a very good plan, and he began to make construction of that, to realize. Yes.
So he built these streets?
Yeah, the street was made at this time, just like as you see it now, with the commerce and with the sellers, the seller of everything, vegetables and also spices, and with colors, smells, and many smells, many colors. It was like that since some time, since the 11th century.
So wandering around here, you still get a flavour of the days of Ibn Tashfin?
Yes, of course, yeah.
The walls that Ibn Tashfin commissioned have been rebuilt many times. But one of his original gates, the Berber, still stands. It's huge, but it's remarkably simple.
The architecture of Almoravid is very simple. The Almoravid came from the Sahara, and they were Muslims, and they have the philosophy of Islam, which is that you have harmony, you have beauty, but simplicity.
I love that, the idea of harmony, of beauty, of simplicity, all of those things together in this state. And every time you pass through here, you're going to remember that. And for those people that felt part of this community, they were tied together by that simple, beautiful philosophy.
And I think it's a philosophy of life.
It's something which begins here.
That's right.
The Almoravids had created a worthy capital. Now they set about establishing an empire. Their army took the jihad north, taking city after city, expanding their influence east as far as Algiers, well beyond what we now call Morocco. Back in Marrakesh, the Almoravids reflected on their extraordinary achievements. It had taken 26 years from their first incursion out of the desert with the taking of Sidi Massa to the point where they controlled the whole of northwest Africa. Their next move extended the Almoravids' jihad beyond anyone's expectations, north into Europe. A parallel Islamic world had existed in Spain and Portugal since the early 8th century. It was called Al-Andalus, and it had flourished under the Caliph of Cordoba into a rich civilization of lavish palaces and elegant gardens. Now in the 11th century, it had broken up into weaker city-states. These were being attacked by Christian armies from the north of Spain, and the Muslim rulers appealed to the Almoravids for help. Yusuf ibn Tashfin helped repel the Christians, but he was disgusted at the decadence of the Muslim princes he'd agreed to help. Ibn Tashfin had enough of these party princes and their moaning. He also disliked their lack of dedication to Islam. But he decided he had an obligation to save the souls of their Muslim subjects, and in 1090 he returned in force and deposed their rulers one by one. The Almoravids now ruled over a vast kingdom that reached from the Sahara to Spain and from Africa's Atlantic coast to Algeria. Never before had all this Muslim territory been united under one management, one kingdom united politically and spiritually, and it was the so-called barbarians of the desert that had done it. The beating heart of the kingdom was Marrakesh. This was a place where people came to exchange stories, ideas, stories that had been traded across the desert from as far away as West Africa, stories that had come from southern Europe, from the Middle East. They all ended up here in the central square in Marrakesh. By the beginning of the 12th century, the square here had become the news hub of the empire. But in 1106, the news running around this square was of terrible importance. Yusuf ibn Tashfin had died. Ibn Tashfin was more than 80 years old when he died. He had seen his Berber kingdom grow from the founding days of Marrakesh to the farthest reaches of his empire. But now, the warrior king was dead, and the mantle of ruler of the Almoravids dynasty passed to Ibn Tashfin's 23-year-old son, and a very different era began. One of power and privilege. Ali was the first Almoravid leader not to have known the desert or its hardships. He knew the royal palace and its luxuries. At the time of his father's death, the royal treasury housed 13,000 boxes of silver and 5,400 boxes of minted gold. He was loaded. The new leader worked hard to make Marrakesh even more splendid, and he ordered a new palace to be built. It was part of a beautification plan for the city, which drew heavily on the architectural influences of Andalusia. It was thought that no buildings were left that could show us what Ali's grand vision might have looked like. Then, in 1952, buried under some outbuildings, they found this. The Kubat Baridin. It's not only a rare example of Almoravid architecture, but it gives us some sense of what this city looked like at the high point of the dynasty.
This is the Kuba. This is the masterpiece of the architecture of the Almoravid period.
It is a masterpiece.
Yes.
Professor Muhammad Al-Faiz has written extensively on the buildings of Marrakesh.
And I think that the architects came from Andalusian Spain. They make this jewelry, this very, very beautiful. It's unique in the architecture of Morocco. look at the simplicity of lines
Yes.
and harmony of proportions.
It is absolutely gorgeous. So this was a place where people before prayer would come and they would wash their bodies.
They wash their bodies and they prepare when they go to the mosque.
It's a sumptuous building. It tells us just what Marrakesh may have looked like. It must have been a place with fantastic architecture and also very, very wealthy people who were obviously living the high life.
It's a very rich civilization because Marrakesh was a capital of empire. Like actually when we have New York or other cities, very important.
This delicately carved interior is such a contrast to the bold, simple shape we see outside. It was also highly fashionable. These wonderful scallop shell shapes were common in early Ethiopia, and this is the first time that they've been seen in Africa. Ali wanted nothing but the best. What was Ali bin Yusuf like?
Is different from his father. He was a liberal man. I think that the reign of Ali bin Yusuf is very important because with him we have the development of architecture, of cultural humanities, poets, and it's not the same character of his father.
This is a massive architectural statement in the palace grounds and shows just how far the Almoravids have come since their days as desert warriors bent on holy war. But while Ali beautified the Almoravid capital, the kingdom was starting to slip from his grasp. Under Ali, the link to the desert tradition was broken. And to some, the Almoravids seemed to be going soft. High in the mountains behind the city, a force even more powerful than the Almoravids was stirring. The fires of dissent were being stoked by rival Berbers holed up in the high Atlas Mountains. This precarious mountain track leads to what was, in effect, their mountain hideout. The Almoravids were never comfortable in the hills and mountains of the high Atlas. Whenever they tried to root out trouble, they were evaded. There was plenty of trouble brewing. Here, a new group of Islamic revolutionaries laid the groundwork for their domination of this whole region. They were called the Almohads, meaning the people who believed in the unity of God. The leader of the revolution was Muhammad ibn Tumurt. He wasn't a desert warrior like the Almoravids. He was a mountain blood. Ibn Tumurt had spent decades studying Islam. He claimed to have been divinely chosen to restore the true faith as he understood it. This is Tinmel, the village where Ibn Tumurt started his revolution. From here, he preached against the arrogance and corruption of the Almoravids. Professor Mohammed Rabat-Taddin has studied the power struggle that developed between the Almoravids and their fiercest critic.
La société marocaine, à cette époque-là, était une société purement musulmane. Ibn Tumurt, le rôle d'Ibn Tumurt n'est pas faire l'islamisation ou faire une deuxième fois de l'islamisation de la société. Non. Ce qu'il a fait, c'est une politisation de la religion pour faire ou pour donner une légitimité à son projet politique.
So your interpretation is that the religious manipulation of the text was something that Ibn Tumurt was spearheading as a way of changing regimes.
Cet objectif donne aussi la création de la grande empire islamique dans la Méditerranée occidentale, qui est la dynastie ou l'empire almohade.
So Ibn Tumurt wants to increase his political influence and then go down the mountain to attack Marrakesh.
Tinmel est la base et le point de départ vers Marrakech.
Ibn Tumad undermined support for the Almoravids by questioning their interpretation of Islam, and therefore their claim to legitimate rule. And it goaded Ali bin Yusuf into combat. In 1130, the Battle of Words finally turned to war, and the army of the Almohads came out of the mountains to face the Almoravids and lay siege to their cities. It would be a long campaign. In Marrakesh, the city walls were reinforced and rebuilt by the Almoravids in direct response to the Almohad threat. A culture based on nomadic traditions and tents turned in its most desperate moment to huge walls like this to protect themselves. But their ancient belief that walls imprisoned rather than protected proved true, as they became increasingly confined to the city. It took almost 20 years of skirmishing battles for the Almohads to finally enter the city of Marrakesh. And in 1147, the dynasty of the Almoravids was finally over. Once inside the city walls, the Almohads wanted to stamp their authority on the city, and they started by replacing the most significant of the Almoravids' buildings. This is the Kutubiyya Mosque, named after the Al-Kutubiyan, or the booksellers who used to ply their trade here. It's also Marrakesh's most important building. Legend has it that the predecessor to this mosque was torn down by the Almohads because it wasn't correctly aligned with Mecca. In fact, all the mosques in the city were pulled down and replaced on religious grounds. This sent a big, bold message to the people of Marrakesh. They were making it clear that their way and their interpretation of Islam was the correct one. And anyone arriving in the city got a similar message. This is the Bab-Agnew, or the Gate of Guinea. It was built by one of Ibn Tumad's successors, Sultan Yaqub el-Mansur, in 1185. It's a beautiful gate, this one. So ornate. This is an Almohad gate, and it's so different. Earlier I just did a quick sketch of the Almoravid gate, and the Almoravid gate is just one of those perfect, very, very simple gates. But this one is so different from the Almoravid, and that modesty. It's so much more sumptuous. Layers upon layers of decoration have been built up with this beautiful green stone. This is an empire, a kingdom, and is very, very pleased to announce it to everyone who enters the city. Almost everything the Almohads built seemed more substantial, more impressive than that built by their predecessors. And that included the Berber Kingdom. Just like the rulers before them, the Almohad used Marrakesh as an imperial base for an expansion even more ambitious than their predecessors. The Almohads took over almost all the territory previously run by the Almoravids, and they also seized the neighbouring lands of Ifriqiya, which stretched into what is now Libya. In Spain, they took Andalusia and made Seville their second capital after Marrakesh. Under the Almohads, the kingdom was to become an even stronger force in the Mediterranean than the Almoravids had been. And their wealth and ideas went hand in hand. Here on the bank of the Maghreb is evidence to show how both dynasties used their currency to spread the word of Islam. This is a gold dinar.
Yeah, it's from Sijil Masa, Almoravid dynasty.
I see. That's beautiful. With an Arabic inscription right in the center. What does it say on that?
ومن يبتغي غير الإسلام دينا فلن يقبل منه وهو في الآخرة من الخاسرين.
It shall not be acceptable that anyone takes a faith other than Islam. That's at the center of the coin. So they're actually helping to evangelize. Those coins will circulated of a lot of Mediterranean Sea. We have it in Spain, in Portugal, in London, in Germany, and Holland, and China.
Really?
Yeah.
This was the dollar of it.
Yeah.
Of its day.
Yeah. It's about trade, but it's also taking wherever it goes, religion. Yeah. Because a lot of Christian kingdom used these coins at this time. It's a beautiful thing, absolutely beautiful. The Almoravid's dinar was widely valued. The Almohads wanted to build on its success, but they also wanted to do things differently. They introduced innovations, including a new coin with a square design that proclaimed the ambition of their jihad. So this one is the first round dirham minted by Almohad. It's round, but with a square in the middle. But after this one, so here. Well, okay.
Now that's square.
Yeah. It's square. So they created these circular coins first with the square inscription in the center, and then they reduced them down just to these squares. Technically, in the mint of coins, it's easy to do something the coins which is square. So these squares were much more efficient to be minted because there was much less wastage from a square sheet of silver. That's correct. And it's amazing that that's just a tiny thin wafer of silver, and yet it represents so much. These four sides were seen as being symbolic of the four sides of the kingdom, of the different directions, looking eastward. Eastward towards India, towards China, looking north up toward Europe, looking south towards the desert, and west towards new opportunities. But this is about an empire expanding. Under the Almohads, the Berber kingdom became extraordinarily powerful and wealthy. They undertook increasingly ambitious projects to reflect the magnificence of their empire. These are the Agdal Gardens in the grounds of the Royal Palace in Marrakesh. Almost 1,000 acres of orange, lemon, fig, apricot and pomegranate trees, linked by olive-lined walkways, all irrigated by water brought from the mountains over 20 miles away. And I think they're beautiful. What a gorgeous place. This is the Almohad, using water in such a luxuriant way. I mean, this setting was meant to be a place in which you could come and reflect on this landscape. And what they're using are all the traditional constituent parts of Berber culture. You have here water, you have the palms, you have olives, you have fruit trees. These are things that they would have had in their oases. But what they're using them for here is for recreation, and just simply for people to come and reflect on the beauty of Berber culture. And even today, hundreds of years on, who could doubt that they succeeded? At the end of the 14th century, the Muslim philosopher Ibn Khaldun wrote about the Berber state being just like a garden. Within this garden, the government turned like a wheel. He said that there was no justice without the monarch, no monarch without the army, no army without taxes, no taxes without wealth, and no wealth without justice. Ibn Khaldun's vision of a garden in perfect balance highlighted just how interdependent these elements of government were. Justice was defined by the monarch, who was supported by the army. They were paid for by taxes that were generated by the wealth of its citizens. While all those things were in place and intimately connected, the wheel could continue to turn. And 240 miles north of Marrakesh is a city that shows how well the system worked while it remained in perfect balance. Its Medina is probably the most complete medieval city centre in the world, a place that has changed little since the days of the Almohads. This is Fez, one of the great cities of the empire. Then, as now, a great centre of trade. From here, the Almohad traded in things like sugarcane and cotton, like gold and copper and pottery. But some of the most significant things they built in were ideas. In spite of their religious views, the Almohad were not intellectually repressive. The ancient University of Fez attracted thinkers and scholars from right across the Mediterranean. Deep in the centre of the old Medina was a theological college. It welcomed hundreds of scholars through its doors during the years of the Almohad reign. Librarian Abu Bakr showed me some of the most priceless books in the collection. And this volume is actually illuminated, and some of the words are picked out in gold. And this plate here, written by Ibn Tulumak, he describes in detail his interpretation of the finer points of the Quran. Oh! Look at that! You'd come in here obviously to learn, but this is just so uplifting visually as well. It's just such a privilege to see. It's just the richness of it.
ازدهارا علميا كبيرا وحركة علمية كبيرة تجلت في الخصوص في ظهور شخصيات مرموقة في مختلف العلوم، سواء في مجال الفكري أو التاريخ أو الطب والفلسفة وكذلك العلوم الشرعية وباقي العلوم الأخرى.
One of the scholars who worked here, perhaps surprisingly, was Moses Maimonides, still regarded as the most important Jewish philosopher for the past 2,000 years. And this beautifully bookworm-ridden volume was written by another of the intellectual titans that were based here, the Andalusian philosopher Ibn Rashid, known in Europe as Averroes. Oh, look at that. Most famous for his commentary on the works of Aristotle, he was a significant link between the ideas of ancient Greece and medieval Europe. Page after page. On its extremely delicate, wafer-thin pages are his thoughts on Islamic law.
وعنوانه بداية المجتهد ونهاية المقتصد، وكتاب في الفقه. فهذه الفترة عرفت يعني ازدهارا فيما يتعلق بمجال التأليف.
It's fascinating because these are figures who talk about Islamic studies, but they're putting it into a much wider intellectual context. Here there are all of these great thinkers all working together, and they're pushing philosophy, pushing on astronomy, pushing on a number of great disciplines further than anywhere else in the area around the Mediterranean.
ونحن عندنا في ديننا في الدين الإسلامي قولة تقول أو حكمة أن الحكمة هي ضالة المؤمن أينما وجدها. يعني هو يبحث عن الحكمة أينما كانت، فهو يستفيد ولا يتحرج أن ينفتح على كل العلوم سواء كانت علوم إسلامية أو غير إسلامية، فهو يستفيد منها ويعني يحاول أن يوظفها في علومه.
These weren't just people who were interested in business, in conquering their neighbours. Just look at this. They knew beauty, and they knew how to celebrate it. These are exquisite books. Absolutely exquisite. Directly outside the college, the atmosphere is peppered with the almost constant sound of hammering. The Medina is still a place of work. At the height of the Almohad Empire, Fez had 372 mills, 9,082 shops, 47 soap factories and 188 pottery workshops. This wasn't so much as a market town, as a centre of industry. And in one corner of Medina is an ancient industry as old as the city itself. Binding and protecting the priceless books and their precious contents are some of the finest leather in the world. And it's still made today as it would have been during the Almohad's reign. The skins are first scraped free of hair and fat, then soaked in lime bars, before being softened in a mixture of guano and water. It's a process that is still remarkably natural. What do you actually use to dye? This is a herb that you're using to dye it.
هذا كيكون خارج شويه من الجلد. هذا طبيعي غير ديال الشجر. هذا غير ديال الشجر هذا كيتطحن كندير.
This is all natural. So this bright pink is a natural substance. So this process literally has remained unchanged for hundreds of years.
هذه بديه ما عندهاش شي احسن من غير هذه الخدمه ديالها اللي كتبقى.
Way before Henry Ford famously created his factory for assembling cars, the Berbers of Fez already had a production line. Intellectually and economically, the Almohads were in charge of an empire that ranked alongside the greatest of that time anywhere in the world. This was the high point of the Berber Kingdom, but controlling such a massive realm brought its own problems. By the end of the 12th century, this fort at Rabat overlooked an armada of ships at anchor. The Almohads controlled substantial amounts of the Atlantic and Mediterranean coast, and armies were being carried by sea to far-off battlegrounds. Seaports like Rabat had become crucial, and by the end of the 12th century, the Almohads' greatest ruler, Yaqub el-Mansur, developed the town into his military headquarters. First came the fortification of the old town with ramparts and gates, and then, in 1195, something really grand. It had 400 columns and pillars. It was big enough to hold an entire army, and it would have been the largest mosque in the Islamic West, if not the entire Muslim world. As ambitious as the great Roman architecture of North Africa or the buildings of Mecca, it spoke to their heritage and to God, and it was as permanent a statement as could be made. But we'll never know if this would have been the grandest mosque in the world, as it isn't just a ruin, it's an unfulfilled dream. The reason why there's no top on the minaret or roof on the prayer hall here is that in 1199, only 4 years after work started, Yaqub el-Mansur died. The mosque remained in its unfinished state. His grand vision was never completed. El-Mansur was the last strong leader of the Almohads, and his death marked a critical turning point. It was the beginning of the end of the Almohad dynasty. Squabbles over his succession allowed rival Berber tribes to vie for power, and the weakness at the centre had repercussions further afield. In Androthea, a fundamentalist Christian crusade gained the upper hand against the equally fundamentalist jihad. The Almohads were humiliated by the Christians in a decisive battle in Spain, from which their army never really recovered. And the grip on Ifrica was lost as Arab tribes rebelled against the Almohad rulers. Professor Al-Fayez has studied the factors that led to the decline of the Almohad Berber Kingdom.
There are external factors. Almohad army facing the Christian army in Spain, they don't succeed. They lost also the control of the Mediterranean Sea.
So on every front, things are collapsing in.
Economic factors are very important in the explanation of the decline. They don't control the trade. There is no money, no budget to control population.
Internally, They lose their tax revenue as local people begin to turn against them. The different ethnic groups then begin to fracture and fight against the regime. And gradually, the empire begins to disintegrate. So it is that kind of, that wheel, that problem of one of those factors breaking down means that the whole empire then begins to fail.
All these factors contribute in time to the collapse of this dynasty.
In 1269, Almohad rule ended when a rival Berber dynasty seized power in Marrakesh. The collapse of the Almohad Empire didn't happen overnight, it happened over decades. But nothing that followed could come even close to what they had achieved. None of the Berber dynasties that succeeded the Almohads was powerful enough to rule North Africa. Attempts to return to the glory days of the Almohads failed. In the 16th century, the Kingdom of Morocco was revived. But this vast palace was built by a different dynasty, claiming the right to rule as true interpreters of Islam. And these people saw themselves as Arabic, not Berber. The importance of Islam altered the identity of the kingdom. The same religious zeal that had brought the African Berbers an Islamic empire had ensured that it would be an Arab dynasty claiming direct descent to the Prophet Muhammad that would rule the kingdom that the Berber had created. An Arab dynasty is still in power today. After 5 centuries of Arab rule, many now think of Morocco as an Arab state with an Arab history. This is a kingdom with roots that are distinctly African. A group of indigenous nomads from the desert had achieved what no one else has ever done. They united a disparate group of Berber peoples under the banner of Islam and created an African empire that stretched into Europe. The Berber story deserves its place among the continent's great histories.
This Friday here on BBC HD, it's Baka, a cry from the rainforest. The story of a pygmy tribe undergoing change. And you can see that Friday night at 9. Tonight, how to get the nectar flowing in your own back garden. Bees, butterflies and blooms next.